But his very first job was working at Lab X, at the height of the Cold War. The Soviets wanted to be able to destroy the enemies of the revolution and get away with it. That meant poison. Lab X's job was to find the right toxins.
If you are in the house and you are in the kitchen, it's easier to use poison with meals which you prepare. If he is in the separate room and we have the ventilation, we can send this gas which will poison the lungs. If we have the access to the car of the victim, we put the poison on the wheel of the driver, and he is touching the wheel, and it goes through the skin.
Lab X became the first place to test a huge variety of poisons on death row prisoners, using live human beings as lab rats. It was the cruelest and most advanced toxins lab in the world. The most terrifying experiments took place in a row of 5 cells, called the Chamber Lab. Political prisoners and suspected spies were brought here, through the tunnel. They were administered differing amounts of poison, and then the scientists watched them die. They often had a new set of prisoners delivered every week. Anyone who wasn't dead from poison in 14 days was executed, sometimes testing new explosive bullets. Lab X soon had the perfect poisoner's toolkit, a toxin for every eventuality.
The main goal is to liquidate the enemy of the state.
Cyanide always held on at number 1, but Lab X's top 10 included some terrifying and effective poisons.
Strychnine is a pretty horrific poison. Death is painful and prolonged, going in and out of painful muscle spasms to die of exhaustion, metabolic disturbances, and eventually respiratory failure.
Korea, 1958. During peace talks, the entire North Korean delegation is found dead. For Lab X, it's an exciting chance to track down a new toxin. The murder was carried out with a drug called curare.
Somebody would be paralyzed, collapsed, lying on the ground, incredibly anxious, almost certainly knowing that they're going to die. After a minute or two, their consciousness would cloud, but the fright and the horror of somebody who's got curare poisoning would be massive for that short period of time.
The scientists from Lab X didn't just do research, they got their hands dirty. This is the only known surviving photo of their chief, Grigory Marinovsky, poisoner extraordinaire. It's his work that makes politicians frightened to go to hospital in Ukraine. In the winter of 1946, the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church was injured in a car crash set up by the KGB. He survived. While he was in hospital convalescing, a doctor came to give him an injection. It was Marinovsky in disguise. The Archbishop was dead in seconds. No one knows what poison was used. The best guess is cyanide. For the men who worked with these poisons, the fear that they too may be victims of unseen killers never goes away. KGB General Oleg Kalugin defected in 1994.
Well, I'm not a type who is easily scared, but as a professional, I'm looking around. I know who I'm dealing with. I try to make sure that people I meet are the right people. As I say, those who are doomed to be hanged will not drown.
Lab X is still in operation, and the fruits of 70 years' research are still being put to use. Viktor Yushchenko returns to Kiev from hospital. He has a hectic schedule of public appearances. His supporters are passionate. The election stands on a knife edge. Yushchenko lasts 10 days. The pain never went away. Now it's unbearable. His bodyguard drags him back to the doctors in Vienna.
He developed severest pain, comparable to pain after a car accident or after falling out of a building.
The doctors are still confused by Yushchenko's symptoms. They don't know what to do to help him. The election is slipping away.
It was impossible to ease the pain. He said, "I have to win." I supported him and said, "We don't have the right to lose. There are 47 million people behind us." We held each other by the hand.
For those around Yushchenko, it's torture even to watch his suffering.
I was thinking all the time that my friend was dying. The father of 5 children, who I love. For the first time in my life, I knelt. I never kneel. I knelt down and prayed to God for the whole of Ukraine, that he remained alive. Those terrible days in intensive care will remain with me forever.
But while he's at the hospital, the case takes an unprecedented turn. Viktor Yushchenko has a new symptom.
During the second admission, he had an acute inflammation in his face.
Yushchenko was young and charismatic, a change from the old men who ran Ukraine for generations. Now, almost overnight, he's been transformed into the pockmarked, bloated figure he is today. His skin is covered in lesions and scar tissue. The search for a mystery disease is abandoned. There is no disease which can do all this. There's one answer at the back of every mind. Anywhere else it would seem incredible. In the former Soviet Union, it's perfectly possible. Yushchenko's doctors start to suspect that he's been poisoned. Security has stepped up around the stricken candidate. As a last resort, the doctors go public.
We approached the public and our colleagues from abroad asking for help.
Blood samples are sent to the world's 3 leading toxicology labs. They carry out tests for the 20 commonest poisons. They don't find anything. Yushchenko is not the first leader to be struck down by a mysterious illness. In one of the most ironic accusations in Russian history, Edvard Radzinsky thinks he's identified another victim of poisoning. Stalin himself. Stalin had killed millions, sent more to the Gulag. In the era of purges and show trials, the whole of Russia lived in fear. Now an old man, increasingly paranoid, it looked like he was about to launch one last bloody round of murders. His closest allies thought they were next. Radzinsky believes they struck first. Stalin was spending the night of the 28th of February 1953 at his dacha on the outskirts of Moscow. 50 years later, it's still under heavy security. Radzinsky has tracked down the last surviving guard from that night. The guard explained he was given the order to go to bed. This was unique. Normally, Stalin taunted them for being tired. But the order wasn't given directly by Stalin. It was delivered by the commander of the guard, Colonel Krustalov. The next day, the guard found the dictator lying on the floor in a coma, from which he was never to recover. Radzinsky believes Krustalov poisoned him in the night on KGB orders.
I think that Mr. Krustalov come inside of Stalin room and make this injection. This poison created feeling of illness. Stalin dropped like after stroke.
The conspirators chose a poison that gave them a chance to seize power while Stalin lay in a coma. Officially, he died of a stroke. The KGB chief who masterminded the plot got away with this murder. A year later, he was arrested and shot for the thousands of others he'd been responsible for. Stalin was dead, but the work of Lab X went on. At the height of the Cold War, they found what seemed to be the perfect poison. It was to be at the center of the most famous and bizarre poisoning of all, the Markov case. Georgy Markov was a dead man from the moment an agent accidentally knocked into him on Waterloo Bridge on the 7th of September in 1978. It took him 5 days to die. Markov was working in London as a broadcaster for the BBC, relaying pro-Western material to his communist homeland of Bulgaria. His former friend, the president, didn't like what Markov was revealing. He turned to the Soviet Union for help in ridding himself of this annoyance.
The request was to help Bulgarian security services to assassinate Markov.
Kalugin was given his orders by the head of the KGB.
I was a KGB officer, a military officer. I had to obey orders. Had I not carried them out, I would be shot, poisoned, or put at best in a psychiatric institution.
Kalugin ordered his men to give the Bulgarians what they needed. As Markov crossed Waterloo Bridge, an agent carrying a specially modified umbrella fired a pellet containing poison into Markov's leg. He carried on to his office just at the end of the bridge and went home that night. The next day he came to hospital running a high fever, feeling unwell.
What came across, I think, was that he was extremely frightened and was convinced that he was going to die. I think the first reaction of doctors, if somebody comes in saying, I've been stabbed in my calf and I'm going to die, is, you know, should we call the psychiatrists?
Nick Feiner was the last doctor to see Markov alive.
When I saw him, I remember, I mean, he was dying and he needed to have a wire put in his heart to speed the heart up. And so that was the last thing that any of us could think of doing.
Markov was suffering massive organ failure. 2 days later, he was dead. For the doctors, it was still a mystery what had killed him. They examined his x-rays with a fine tooth comb, looking for any clue.
And the x-ray went up and everybody was just looking and they couldn't see anything. And then the radiologist brought out her magnifying glass and held it up to the x-ray, and suddenly she said, you know, I think there is something there. And we all crowded round the x-ray box, and there we saw this little pellet. And that was the moment, and it still sends a shiver down my neck, when we suddenly realized that something had happened.
Further tests, carried out in total secrecy, showed the holes in the pellet were filled with a substance called ricin. It had never been seen in Britain before.
Unfortunately, there is nothing that you can do for somebody who has taken ricin. The damage is occurring. We've got no antidote.
What ricin does is basically, it's like throwing the main power supply of the body off. It stops every cell from working. Every cell in the body, the cells in your liver, in your heart, in your kidneys, in the brain.
Ricin was almost the perfect poison for an assassin. A slow, natural-seeming death. A poison that left no trace. But for the pellet, they'd have got away with it. The attack on Viktor Yushchenko wasn't clean or sophisticated. It left its mark etched on his face. Photos of Yushchenko are published in newspapers around the world. The difference between before and after is shocking. In London, leading toxicologist John Henry sees the images. He makes the vital link everyone else has missed. He's the first to realize there's only one poison that can produce this precise combination of symptoms.
When I looked at the picture, I thought, this has to be dioxin. There's no other reasonable cause for it.
The hideous facial inflammation occurs because the dioxin collects in the fatty tissues of the sweat glands.
The reasons I made the diagnosis were because there was little acne-like spots all over, and they're even on the ears, which is something that doesn't occur with ordinary common or garden acne.
Overnight, a precious vial of Yushchenko's blood is flown to Amsterdam. Bram Brewer is the world's leading dioxin hunter. His lab's the only place in the world that can detect such minute amounts.
The level of
bullets. Lab X soon had the perfect poisoner's toolkit, a toxin for every eventuality.
The main goal is to liquidate the enemy of the state.
Cyanide always held on at number 1, but Lab X's top 10 included some terrifying and effective poisons.
Strychnine is a pretty horrific poison. Death is painful and prolonged, going in and out of painful muscle spasms to
the most advanced toxins lab in the world. The most terrifying experiments took place in a row of 5 cells, called the Chamber Lab. Political prisoners and suspected spies were brought here, through the tunnel. They were administered differing amounts of poison, and then the scientists watched them die. They often had a new set of prisoners delivered every week. Anyone who wasn't dead from poison in 14 days was executed, sometimes testing new explosives.
To die of exhaustion, metabolic disturbances, and eventually respiratory failure.
Korea, 1958. During peace talks, the entire North Korean delegation is found dead. For Lab X, it's an exciting chance to track down a new toxin. The murder was carried out with a drug called curare.
Somebody would be paralyzed, collapsed, lying on the ground, incredibly anxious, almost certainly knowing that they're going to die. After a minute or two, they're...
But his very first job was working at Lab X, at the height of the Cold War. The Soviets wanted to be able to destroy the enemies of the revolution and get away with it. That meant poison. Lab X's job was to find the right toxins.
If you are in the house and you are in the kitchen, it's easier to use poison with meals which you prepare. If he is in the separate room and we have the ventilation, we can send this gas which will poison the lungs. If we have the access to the car of the victim, we put the poison on the wheel of the driver, and he is touching the wheel, and it goes through the skin.
Lab X became the first place to test a huge variety of poisons on death row prisoners, using live human beings as lab rats. It was the cruelest